Greystone Hall, Oakhaven. The music dies. A slap echoes off the vaulted ceiling sharper than the crystal flutes freezing in midair. My name is Elizabeth Carter, and to the wealth-obsessed crowd staring at me, I am a ghost. A disappointment. My mother stands before me, hand still raised, convinced she has just put me in my place. She believes she struck a helpless failure. She has no idea she just declared war on the daughter who secretly owns the very empire she is trying to impress. The sting on my cheek is burning, but the silence that follows is colder. It is the sound of a carefully built lie shattering. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The sound of a slap is distinct. It doesn't sound like a punch, which is a dull thud, or a clap, which is celebratory. A slap is a crack. It is sharp, wet, and humiliatingly loud. That specific sound echoed off the hand-painted vaulted ceilings of the historic Greystone Hall, slicing right through the delicate strains of a Mozart concerto being performed by a live string quartet. The room filled with the sort of people who treat wealth like a religion and silence like a currency froze. Champagne flutes stopped halfway to lips. The murmur of polite, high society gossip evaporated instantly. I stood there, my cheek burning with a heat that spread rapidly down my neck, staring into the eyes of my mother, Margaret Carter. She was breathing hard, her chest heaving beneath a dress that cost more than most people's cars. She looked terrified, not because she had just physically assaulted her daughter in front of 200 of the state's most influential donors, politicians, and business leaders, but because for the first time in my life, I didn't look down. I didn't cry. I didn't apologize for existing. "You are a ghost," she had hissed, just seconds before the strike, her voice a venomous whisper designed to cut me without alerting the nearby table of investors. "You are a charity case, Elizabeth. You are a stain on this family, and I will not let you ruin your sister's moment with your jealous, pathetic little presence." She had expected me to shrink. That was the script. I was supposed to be the mousy, disappointing daughter who scurried away to the kitchen or the shadows. Instead, I had simply looked at her and told her the truth. And that truth was so intolerable to her carefully curated reality that she had no choice but to hit me. But here is what my mother didn't know as she stood there, her hand still stinging from the impact, watching the room stare at us in horrified judgment. She didn't know that the vintage champagne the waiters were pouring, I knew the distributor personally because I had renegotiated his import tariffs 3 months ago. The exotic orchids cascading from the centerpieces. My logistics fleet had prioritized their delivery from a storm-delayed freighter in Miami 48 hours prior. The little work she loved, mocking the job she told her friends was administrative support, had literally funded half the luxuries in this room. My mother thought she was slapping a failure. She had no idea she was slapping the silent architect of the very world she was desperate to belong to. To understand why I stood there and took it, you have to understand the fiction of Elizabeth Carter versus the reality of who I actually am. In the town of Oakhaven, where your last name is your credit score, I am known as Liz. Liz lives in a 1-bedroom apartment on the wrong side of the bridge. Liz drives a 4-year-old sedan with a dent in the rear bumper. Liz works a nondescript job that involves computers and spreadsheets. Something vague that allows the Carter family to sigh and tell their country club friends she gets by, bless her heart. She's just not driven like Madeline. This performance is intentional. I realized in my early 20s that in a family obsessed with leverage, the only safety lies in appearing useless. If you have nothing, they can't take anything from you. So I let them believe the lie. The truth is that I am the founder and majority shareholder of erratic but highly profitable holding companies that specialize in high-end logistics, crisis procurement, and luxury supply chain management. I don't put my name on headlines. I don't do Forbes interviews. My ownership is buried under layers of boring-sounding trusts and LLCs, Arrowhead Logistics, Summit Vendor Solutions, Blue Harbor Holdings. It is standard practice for wealthy founders who value privacy over ego, but for me, it was a survival tactic. I built a high-margin empire quietly at night and on weekends turning a small freight brokering side hustle into a beast that moves goods for the very brands my family worships. My parents, Thomas and Margaret, treat people like assets. You are either an appreciating asset like my sister Madeline, or a depreciating one like me. They raised me as the practice child. I was the draft copy they marked up with red ink before they moved on to the final masterpiece. Every mistake I made was proof of my inherent flaw. Every success I had was dismissed as a fluke. By the time Madeline was born 4 years later, they had refined their methods. They poured all their hope, money, and neuroses into her. Madeline isn't evil. I have to remind myself of that constantly. She is beautiful, curated, and terrifyingly fragile. She has been conditioned to equate love with approval. She has never made a decision without consulting our mother first. Not her college major, not her wardrobe, and certainly not her fiancé. Ethan Hale is the fiancé in question, the reason for tonight's exorbitant gala. He is the golden boy of the eastern seaboard, a man whose family comes from respectable wealth, the kind that whispers rather than shouts. He looks like he was grown in a laboratory designed to produce senators. On paper, this engagement is the merger my parents have been salivating over for decades. It solidifies the Carter reputation, which, unbeknownst to the town, has been built on a foundation of crumbling debt and maxed-out credit lines for years. They needed this wedding. They needed the optics of success to keep the wolves at bay. That was why I wasn't supposed to be there. 3 days before the engagement party, I received the text. It came from Madeline's number, but the syntax was all wrong. Madeline uses emojis. She softens her blows with hearts and exclamation points. She apologizes before she even asks for a favor. The message I received was cold, grammatically perfect, and surgical. Please don't come tonight. Let's not make this about you. It would be better for everyone if you stayed home. It was Mom. I knew it instantly. She had taken my sister's phone, typed out the rejection, and hit send, confident that I would do what I always did, swallow the hurt, make an excuse to anyone who asked, and disappear. She wanted a clean tableau, the successful parents, the radiant bride, the wealthy groom. She didn't want the ghost drifting around the edges, reminding everyone that the Carters weren't perfect. I sat in my modest living room staring at that text message for an hour. My phone buzzed with work notifications, a shipment of Italian silk clearing customs in New York, a frantic email from a tech CEO needing server racks overnighted to Austin, but I couldn't look away from the screen. For years, I had told myself I was taking the high road. I told myself that by not fighting back, by building my own life in the shadows, I was winning. But looking at those words, I realized the high road had just been a scenic route back to humiliation. They didn't just want me gone. They wanted me erased. They had trained the entire town to see me as a failure so they could maintain their narrative of superior parenting. If I was the black sheep, their treatment of me was tough love. If I was successful, their treatment of me would be revealed for what it was, abuse. I stood up and walked to my closet. I pushed past the sensible cardigans and the slacks I wore to play the role of Liz. In the back inside a garment bag I rarely unzipped was a dress I had bought in Paris during a business trip I told my parents was a camping vacation. It was simple, elegant, and cut from a fabric that whispered quality to anyone who knew what they were looking at. I wasn't going to the party to ruin it. I told myself that lie as I zipped the dress. I wasn't going to flip tables or scream at the DJ. I wasn't going to expose the fact that my parents were leveraged to the hilt, or that they were using this marriage as a financial life raft. I was going because I was tired of being edited out of my own family history. I checked my reflection in the mirror. I looked like Elizabeth Carter, the CEO, not Liz, the disappointment. I made myself a promise as I picked up my keys I would not scream. I would not cry. I would simply go hold a glass of champagne and exist. I would force them to look at me. I would observe them not as their daughter, but as the operator I had become. I would watch the mechanics of their little social performance, and I would remember everything. I drove to the venue, a sprawling estate on the cliffs overlooking the ocean. The parking lot was filled with luxury SUVs and vintage convertibles. I parked my sensible sedan between a Porsche and a Jaguar, a visual metaphor that almost made me laugh. I could feel the dread pooling in my stomach, that old childhood reflex of fearing my mother's gaze, but I pushed it down. I had negotiated contracts with sharks in Singapore and union leaders in Chicago. I could handle a cocktail party in my hometown. Walking toward the entrance, I saw the warm glow of the chandeliers spilling out onto the lawn. I could hear the music. I could hear the laughter. It sounded like a fairy tale, but I knew better. I knew that inside that room my mother was performing the role of the benevolent matriarch, my father was slapping backs and playing the tycoon, and my sister was smiling until her face hurt. I took a deep breath of the salt air. I didn't know yet that the night would end in violence. I didn't know that my mother's control was so brittle that my mere presence would shatter it. I didn't know that by the end of the night I would be making calls to my attorney and my head of security. All I knew was that I was done hiding. I walked up the stone steps past the security guard who looked at my name on the list, hesitated, and then waved me through with a confused frown. I pushed open the heavy oak doors and stepped into the light. The air inside smelled of expensive perfume and old money. I scanned the room, my eyes adjusting to the candlelight. It took less than 30 seconds for my mother to spot me. Her smile didn't drop, it just froze. Her eyes narrowed, sharpening into that familiar predatory glare. Across the room, she excused herself from a circle of women wearing diamonds the size of knuckles and began to move toward me. She moved like a shark, cutting through water, silent and inevitable. I tightened my grip on my clutch. I didn't retreat. I waited. This was the moment. This was the beginning of the end, though neither of us knew it yet. I prepared myself for a snub, a cold shoulder, a passive-aggressive comment. I didn't expect the slap. But as I watched her approach, I realized something shifted in me. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, clinical curiosity. Let her come, I thought. Let's see what she does when the ghost refuses to disappear. The room didn't go silent the moment I fully entered. It was worse than that. The noise shifted frequency. It went from the dull, comfortable roar of unbothered wealth to the sharp staccato whispers of people who sense blood in the water. I stood near the archway, my simple navy dress serving as a stark contrast to the sea of sequins taffeta and aggressive displays of diamonds. I could feel the judgment radiating off the crowd like heat. To them, my understated appearance read as poverty or at the very least a lack of effort. They didn't know that the silk blend of my dress was custom-milled in Lion, or that the watch on my wrist was a limited-run piece given to me by the CEO of a Swiss shipping conglomerate after I saved his quarter-end logistics. To them, I was just poor Liz, the Carter who didn't launch. As my mother closed the distance between us, I forced myself to look away from her predatory gaze and scan the room. That's when the first loose thread snagged my attention. A waiter breezed past me with a tray of champagne, the flutes frosted perfectly. I glanced at the label on the bottle he was holding, Vignoble de Saint-Hilaire 2018. My stomach tightened. That wasn't just a high-end champagne. It was a boutique label with extremely limited distribution. In fact, it was exclusively distributed in the Northeast by Blue Harbor Holdings, one of my shell companies. We had barely cleared the import manifest 3 days ago. It shouldn't have been here. It was allocated for high-tier restaurant partners only. I kept walking, my senses now on high alert. I looked at the floral arrangements, massive architectural towers of white hydrangeas and rare orchids. I recognized the design style immediately. It was Fleur & Comby, a high-end vendor based in Boston. I knew them well because 6 months ago, they had faced a liquidity crisis due to a failed merger, and my fintech arm Summit Vendor Solutions had stepped in to bridge their operations. They were on a strict credit diet. There was no way they would have extended a line of credit for an event of this size to Thomas and Margaret Carter, whose credit rating I knew for a fact was hovering just above junk status. The dread began to curdle into suspicion. My parents were throwing a party that easily cost 6 figures, the catering, the venue, the florals, the wine. Yet the last time I spoke to my father, he had casually asked if I could loan him $500 for a car repair. The math wasn't just bad, it was impossible. Something here stank, and it wasn't the cheese board. Elizabeth. The boom of my father's voice interrupted my analysis. Thomas Carter stood near the bar holding court with a group of men in tuxedos. He waved me over with the exaggerated enthusiasm of a man trying to sell a used car. "Everyone look who decided to grace us, it's Liz." I walked over, keeping my face neutral. "Hello, Dad." He clamped a heavy hand on my shoulder, squeezing just hard enough to be uncomfortable. He turned to the man on his left. "Ethan's father, Mr. Hale. Liz here is our free spirit. Works in, what is it again? Honey, some sort of clerical thing, filing papers." "Logistics," I said quietly. Right. Logistics." He chuckled, rolling his eyes as if I'd said I was a professional clown. "She keeps the lights on at some warehouse somewhere. Honest work, right?" The group laughed. It was a rich man's laugh, deep, dismissive, and entirely at my expense. I saw Mr. Hale look at me with pity. "Well," he said, trying to be kind, "it's good to have you here, Elizabeth. Your parents have really pulled out all the stops tonight. Thomas was just telling us how he's managed to turn the family portfolio around this quarter." "Turn it around?" I asked, my voice level. My father's grip on my shoulder tightened painfully. "Just market fluctuations, Liz. You wouldn't understand the complexities of high-level asset management." He steered me away before I could ask a follow-up, pushing me toward the center of the room where my sister was accepting compliments. Madeline looked breathtaking in a white cocktail dress that probably cost more than my first car. But when she saw me, the light died in her eyes. She broke away from a bridesmaid and hurried over, grabbing my elbow and pulling me slightly aside. "You came," she whispered, her voice tight. "I'm your sister Maddie. I wanted to see you." "Mom is furious," she hissed, glancing over my shoulder. "Can you just please not make a scene, just for one night, Liz? Don't make this about you." That sentence landed like a physical blow. Don't make this about you. As if I had ever made anything about me. As if I hadn't spent 20 years making myself smaller so she could shine brighter. I looked at her, searching for some sign of the sister who used to sneak into my bed during thunderstorms, but all I saw was a terrified woman protecting her fragile reality. "I wasn't planning a scene," I said softly. "I was planning to exist. Is that allowed?" Before she could answer, my mother arrived. The air pressure in the immediate vicinity seemed to drop. She didn't shout. Margaret Carter didn't shout. She smiled a razor-thin smile for the benefit of the room, while her eyes drilled into me. "You have 5 minutes," she said through her teeth, her voice low and trembling with suppressed rage. "Drink a glass of water, say hello to your aunt, and then leave. I will not have you dragging your cloud of failure over this family's triumph." Triumph. I looked around the room, the pieces finally clicking together in my mind. The specific vendors, the champagne, the sudden turnaround of the family finances. "Mom, how are you paying for this?" "That is none of your business," she snapped. "It is if you're using money you don't have," I said, my voice rising just slightly. "I know these vendors, Mom. I know how they operate. They don't work on promises." "You know nothing," she spat, stepping closer, invading my personal space. "You are jealous. You have always been jealous of Madeline. You can't stand that she's marrying into a good family while you rot in that apartment." "I'm not jealous," I said, and for the first time I let the mask slip. I let the CEO voice come through, the voice that commanded boardrooms. "I'm worried. You can't keep buying love with money you don't have. Eventually the bill comes due." That was the line. The truth was too sharp, too direct. It pierced the bubble of delusion she had built around herself. Her hand moved before I could flinch. Crack. The slap echoed. The music didn't stop immediately, but the conversation did. Heads turned. I stood there, the sting blooming on my cheek, the room plunging into a horrified silence. My mother stood frozen, her hands suspended, her chest heaving. For a second, the mask of the perfect family lay shattered on the floor between us. Then the reset happened. It's a phenomenon unique to the upper class. When something truly ugly happens, they collectively decide it didn't. Conversations resumed a little louder than before. People turned their backs. The string quartet surged into a slightly more aggressive waltz. They were editing me out in real time. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I turned on my heel and walked toward the powder room, my head high. Inside the bathroom, I locked the door and leaned against the marble sink. I looked at myself in the mirror. My left cheek was bright red, the imprint of her fingers clearly visible against my pale skin. I touched it. It hurt, but the pain felt distant, like it was happening to someone else. In that mirror, something shifted. For years, I had viewed my parents' cruelty as a cage I was trapped in. I thought if I just behaved better, achieved more, or stayed quieter, they would stop. But looking at the red mark on my face, I realized they didn't slap me because I was wrong. They slapped me because I was right. Their anger wasn't strength, it was panic. Humiliation is only a cage if you are afraid of it. If you stop caring about their opinion, their leverage evaporates. And in its place, you find a weapon. I pulled out my phone. My hands were perfectly steady. I sent 3 texts. First to my personal attorney, a pit bull of a man named Marcus, who had been handling my corporate structuring for 5 years. I need you on standby. Potential fraud involving family accounts. Prepare the cease and desist templates. I'll send details in 20. Second to my head of operations, Sarah Urgent. Access the client portals for Arrowhead Summit and Fleur and Cobain. Run a query for any invoices billed to Carter Family Trust or Thomas Carter. Cross-reference with authorized user lists. I need the PDFs now. Third to a contact named David, an investigative journalist for The Globe who specialized in white-collar crime. You asked for a scoop on local fake wealth schemes. I'm at the Greystone Hall. You might want to get down here. I'm about to give you the lead of the year. I splashed cold water on my face, fixed my hair, and unlocked the door. I wasn't leaving. I was going to work. I re-entered the party, but this time I wasn't a guest. I was an auditor. I moved through the crowd, no longer avoiding gazes. I walked straight to the bar. Vodka soda lime, I said to the bartender. He was a young guy, maybe 22, looking terrified by the tension in the room. He slid the drink over a napkin. You okay, miss? He murmured, keeping his voice below the noise of the crowd. That was intense. I'm fine, I said, tipping him $100 bill I pulled from my clutch. Question: who signed for the inventory tonight? The manager. He hesitated, then glanced at the bill. Actually, a guy in a gray suit was back here earlier yelling at the manager about the champagne count. Said he was the financial guarantor, acting really twitchy. Gray suit, balding red tie. Yeah, that's him. I nodded. That was Arthur Henderson, a local banker and a longtime friend of my father. I scanned the room and found him near the terrace doors. He was sweating, wiping his forehead with a handkerchief, pacing back and forth. He wasn't acting like a guest. He was acting like an accomplice. I moved closer, weaving through the crowd collecting data. I paused near a pillar where Ethan's father was speaking to a group of investors. Thomas assures me the liquidity issues are solved, Mr. Hale was saying, swirling his scotch. Apparently he's got a silent partner, some logistics firm. He showed me the credit authorization letters. It's the only reason we agreed to the venue upgrade. My blood ran cold. A silent partner. A logistics firm. My phone buzzed. It was Sarah. She had sent a PDF attachment with a simple message: Liz, you need to see this. The billing address is your parents', but the corporate authorization code is yours. It's the master key code for the Summit vendor account. Who gave them this? I stared at the screen. They hadn't just borrowed money. They hadn't just lied. They had stolen my identity. They had used my name, my corporate authority, and my credit lines, the ones I had spent a decade building flawless relationships with, to fund their vanity project. They were burning my reputation to keep theirs warm. The twist wasn't that they were broke. The twist was that they were leveraging me to pretend they weren't. They mocked my little job to my face while stealing the keys to my kingdom behind my back. I looked up from my phone. Across the room, I made eye contact with Mrs. Gable, my high school English teacher, who had been invited as a friend of the family. She looked at me with profound sadness, her hand over her mouth. She had seen the slap. She remembered the girl I used to be, the one who wrote essays about justice and truth. Next to her, my cousin Ben, who I hadn't seen in 3 years, caught my eye. He walked over looking uncomfortable. "Liz," he said quietly. "Jesus. Are you all right?" "I'm alive, Ben." "Look," he said, lowering his voice. "I didn't want to say anything, but they've been telling everyone you're sick. Mentally, I mean. Aunt Margaret told the in-laws you were unstable and prone to outbursts. That's why everyone looked so scared when you walked in. They thought you were going to snap." It was the final piece of the puzzle. The narrative was complete. They had preemptively discredited me, so that if I ever discovered the fraud and tried to speak up, I would just look like the crazy daughter making a scene. It was diabolical, and it was nearly perfect. Except for one thing, they didn't know I had the receipts. I looked at my parents on the dais, beaming, holding hands, preparing for the speeches. They looked so victorious. They thought they had won. They thought the slap had put me back in my box. I took a sip of my drink. I wasn't going to destroy their party with a scream. I wasn't going to throw a tantrum. I was going to destroy their lie with the one thing they couldn't manipulate: documentation. I tapped the screen on my phone, forwarding the PDF to the venue's main event coordinator, whose email I knew by heart because she was my client. Then I signaled to the bartender for a glass of water. It was time for the toasts. And I decided right then and there that I would be making one. The transition from cocktail hour to the formal dinner was a masterclass in denial. The staff professionals, trained to be invisible, ushered the 200 guests toward the banquet tables with practiced smiles, even though the energy in the room had curdled. The slap was the elephant in the room that everyone was aggressively ignoring. My mother had reappeared, her makeup retouched, her smile plastered back on like a decal. She sat at the head table, flanked by the Hales, looking every inch the triumphant matriarch. My father, flushed with scotch and adrenaline, was practically vibrating with self-importance. They thought they had survived the glitch. They thought the Liz problem had been handled. I sat at a table near the back by the kitchen doors, the seat traditionally reserved for the least important cousin or the N+1. It was perfect. From here, I had a clear line of sight to the stage, the projector screen, and the exit. I watched as the best man, a fraternity brother of Ethan's with a jawline that suggested money and a vocabulary that suggested otherwise, gave a toast that was equal parts charming and vacuous. Then came the maid of honor, who cried on cue about Madeline's perfect heart. The room was bathed in soft golden light. It was beautiful. It was expensive. It was a fraud. Then the moment arrived. My father stood up, tapping a spoon against his crystal flute. The sound rang out sharp and demanding. "If I could have everyone's attention," he boomed, his chest puffing out. "We have one last little tradition. Usually we keep the speeches to the bridal party, but as a courtesy, we wanted to offer the floor to Madeline's sister, Elizabeth." He gestured to me with a magnanimous sweep of his hand, his eyes cold and challenging. It was a power move. He was betting that I was too cowed, too unstable, or too ashamed to speak. He was offering me the microphone like a king tossing a scrap of meat to a stray dog, expecting me to either shake my head and decline, or come up and stammer out a pathetic congratulation that would reconfirm my status as the family failure. I stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the floor. The silence that fell over the room was heavy, filled with the collective memory of the slap. I saw Madeline's eyes widen in panic. I saw my mother stiffen her hand, gripping the tablecloth. I walked to the front. I didn't rush. I didn't look down. I walked with the same cadence I used when entering a boardroom to acquire a failing competitor. I took the microphone from my father's hand. He wouldn't let go immediately, a brief tug of war where he tried to assert dominance one last time. I just held his gaze until he blinked and released it. I turned to the room. I didn't smile. Thank you, Dad. I said, my voice steady, amplified clearly through the high-end sound system. And thank you all for being here to celebrate Madeline and Ethan. It truly is a night that none of us will forget. A few polite, nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd. They were waiting for the breakdown. They were waiting for the tears. When I look around this room, I continued, I don't just see a party. I see an incredible amount of work. I see logistics. I see execution. So before I talk about the happy couple, I want to thank the people who actually made tonight possible. The vendors. Confusion began to spread. This wasn't the script. I want to thank Fleur and Cody for the hydrangeas, I said, nodding toward the massive centerpieces. I want to thank the team distributing the Saint-Hilaire champagne. I want to thank the event staff who are working overtime. I paused, letting the silence stretch. I know how hard you work, I said, my voice hardening just a fraction. I know this because I've worked with many of you for years, not as Liz, the sister who lives in a small apartment, but as the owner of Blue Harbor Holdings and Summit Vendor Solutions. The event planner, a woman named Sarah who was standing near the wait station, dropped her clipboard. She stared at me, her mouth falling open as the realization hit. She knew those company names. She knew them because they signed her paychecks during the off-season. You see, I said, turning slightly to face my parents who were now looking at me with a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. My parents love to tell a story. They love to tell you that I'm a ghost, that I'm a charity case, that I'm unstable. I signaled to the back of the room. My head of security, dressed in a black suit that rendered him nearly invisible until now, stepped forward. He wasn't carrying a weapon. He was carrying a tablet connected wirelessly to the room's AV system. But here is the reality, I said. The large projection screen behind the head table, which had been displaying a loop of engagement photos, flickered. The image changed. It wasn't a photo of Madeline. It was a high-resolution PDF of a credit authorization form. This is the contract for tonight's venue. I narrated, my voice clinical, stripping away all emotion to leave only the facts. And this, the slide changed to an invoice, is the payment authorization for the catering and the florals. I pointed to the screen. You'll notice the billing address belongs to Thomas and Margaret Carter. But if you look at the guarantor line, the credit authority that actually allowed this transaction to clear, you'll see a corporate code. I read the code aloud. Alpha 79 Victor Zulu. I looked at the banker Arthur Henderson, who was sitting near the front, his face draining of color. Mr. Henderson, you're a banker. You recognize that series, don't you? That's not a personal authorization. That is the master override code for Summit Vendor Solutions Executive Credit Line. My company. Gasps rippled through the room. It wasn't the gasp of scandal. It was the gasp of professionals realizing a crime had been committed. My parents didn't pay for this party, I said, turning back to the crowd. They forged my signature and used a stolen corporate authorization code to bill these expenses to my company. They are not wealthy patrons. They are committing identity theft and corporate fraud against their own daughter. Stop it, my mother screamed. She shot up from her chair, knocking over her wine glass. Red wine bled across the white tablecloth like a gunshot wound. She's lying. She's off her meds. Cut the mic. But nobody moved to cut the mic. The sound technician was staring at the screen where a new document had appeared, a series of emails between my mother and Arthur Henderson discussing how to bypass the verification because Liz won't notice she's not involved in the details. I am always involved in the details, Mother, I said calmly into the microphone. That's how I built the fortune you're trying to steal. I turned to Madeline. She was sitting frozen, her hands over her mouth, looking from the screen to me. She looked like a child watching her house burn down. You didn't know, I said to her, my voice softening just enough to be heard as sorrow, not hate. I know you didn't know, Maddie, but you didn't ask, did you? You let them call me a failure for years. You let them tell people I was crazy. You let them erase me because it kept your world peaceful. You took the luxury and you never asked where the money came from. I looked at Ethan. He was staring at his new in-laws with a look of absolute revulsion. Ethan, I said, if you are walking into this family, you deserve to know the price of admission. They don't just control you, they consume you. This is what they do when someone won't obey. They steal your name, and then they tell the world you're insane, so no one will believe you when you scream. My mother lunged. She scrambled past the bridal table, her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hate. She was coming for me, her hands reaching out as if to strangle the words back down my throat. "You ungrateful, selfish bitch!" She shrieked, the veneer of the society dame completely gone. "I gave you life. How dare you shaming us? You're sick, you're sick!" She reached me, grabbing my arm, raising her hand for another slap. I caught her wrist. I didn't squeeze. I didn't twist. I just held it there mid-air. The room was dead silent. "You hit me earlier," I said, my voice low but amplified enough that every person in the room heard the steel in it. "You hit me because you can't hit the truth. The truth is, Mom, you're not the victim. You're the liability." I released her wrist. She stumbled back, not from force, but from the shock of losing power. That was the signal. From the side entrance, my attorney Marcus stepped into the light. He wasn't alone. He was flanked by 2 process servers. He walked straight up to the head table, bypassing the drama, and placed a thick stack of documents in front of my father. "Thomas Carter," Marcus announced, his voice projecting clearly. "These are cease and desist orders regarding the unauthorized use of Summit Vendor Solutions assets. You are also being served with a notice of investigation for wire fraud and identity theft." At the same time, the reality of the business world kicked in. The venue manager who had received my forwarded evidence was already on her radio. I saw the head of catering tap his watch and signal his team. It was a quiet corporate panic. Waiters stopped pouring wine. The kitchen doors swung shut and locked. The band began packing up their instruments. The service wasn't ending because of a fight. It was ending because the credit card had been declined. Arthur Henderson, the banker, tried to slip away toward the terrace doors. He made it 3 steps before my head of security stepped politely but firmly into his path. "Mr. Henderson," the guard said, loud enough for the nearby tables to hear, "the police are on their way to take a statement regarding your role in the authorization override. It would be best if you waited here." Ethan's family was already moving. Mr. Hale stood up, buttoned his jacket, and took his wife's arm. They didn't look at my parents. They didn't look at Madeline. They looked at the exit. They were calculating the blast radius, and they were getting out of the zone. I looked back at Madeline. She wasn't looking at Ethan. She wasn't looking at Mom. She was looking at me. For the first time in 20 years, she wasn't looking through me. She was seeing the sister she had abandoned. She saw the dress, the posture, the command of the room. She realized that the poor Liz narrative had been a lie she had happily swallowed. "Liz," she whispered the word, barely audible. "I'm sorry, Maddie," I said, placing the microphone gently on the table. It made a soft thud that sounded like a gavel. "I couldn't let them sell me to buy your wedding." I turned my back on the head table. My mother was sobbing now, a jagged, ugly sound of a woman who realizes the audience has turned against her. My father was staring at the legal papers, gray-faced. I walked toward the exit. The crowd parted for me. They didn't sneer. They didn't whisper. They moved out of my way with the respectful caution one gives to a predator that has just taken down its kill. I had walked in a ghost. I was walking out a titan. The death of a high society party is a unique sensory experience. It doesn't end with a sudden blackout. It dissolves. The energy in Greystone Hall fractured the moment I walked away from the microphone. The air, previously thick with the scent of expensive perfume and entitlement, now smelled of cold sweat and panic. The guests didn't storm out. That would have been too vulgar. Instead, they evaporated. They drifted like smoke toward the valet stand, eyes averted, phones pressed to ears, whispering to drivers to bring the cars around now. I stood in the grand foyer near the heavy oak doors watching the exodus. I wasn't hiding. I was waiting for the inevitable aftershock. It came quickly. My parents cornered me before I could reach the front steps. My mother looked like a different person than the one who had entered the hall an hour ago. Her poise was gone, replaced by a frantic, trembling rage. Her mascara was smeared not from sadness, but from the sheer physical exertion of her hysteria. "How could you?" she hissed, grabbing my arm with a grip that was meant to bruise. "How could you do this to your sister, to us, you spiteful, jealous little creature?" My father was right behind her, his face a mottled purple. He loomed over me using his height as a weapon, a tactic that had worked when I was 12. "You think you're smart, Liz? You think this makes you powerful. You're going to regret humiliating us. I will ruin you. I will tell every person in this town." I shook my mother's hand off my arm. I didn't shove her. I just removed her touch as if it were something sticky and unclean. "You can't tell them anything, Dad," I said, my voice flat. "They just saw the bank statements. The story is over." "You humiliated us," he shouted, indifferent to the fact that the Hales were scurrying past us with their heads down. "You humiliated me for years," I replied, looking him dead in the eye. "You made me a punchline to boost your own ego. Tonight you just had an audience. That's the only difference." Before he could respond, the double doors of the ballroom swung open again. Madeline stood there. She looked like a ghost in her white dress. Her face was streaked with tears, but she wasn't screaming. She walked toward us, her movements stiff like a marionette with tangled strings. "Madeline," Mom gasped, pivoting instantly to victim mode. "Oh, honey, I am so sorry. Your sister, she's sick, she's—" "Stop," Madeline said. It wasn't a shout, but it stopped my mother cold. Madeline looked at me. "Is it true?" "Is what true?" I asked. "Do you own the companies, the vendors?" "Yes." "And did they steal from you?" "Yes." Madeline closed her eyes. She took a shuddering breath. "You ruined everything, Liz. You ruined my wedding. You ruined my life." "I ruined a lie, Madeline," I said gently. "There is a difference." "Why didn't you tell me?" Her voice cracked, finally breaking into a sob. "Why did you let me treat you like you were nothing? I sent you money for groceries last Christmas. I pitied you." "I know," I said. "And I let you pity me because it was safer for you. If you knew I had money, Mom and Dad would have forced you to leverage our relationship to get to it. I stayed small so you could be the golden child without guilt." I pulled my phone out and unlocked it, navigating to the dashboard of Blue Harbor Holdings. I held it out to her. It wasn't a screenshot. It was the live interface showing real-time logistics tracking global assets and the pending fraud alerts on the Carter accounts. "I built this while you were sleeping, Maddie. While they were calling me a failure, I was building the supply chain that keeps this town running. I didn't want to hurt you, but I couldn't let them drag me into a felony to pay for your party." Madeline stared at the screen. She saw the numbers. She saw the truth. The horror on her face wasn't about the wedding anymore. It was the realization that her entire worldview, the benevolent parents, the successful family, the loser sister, was a fabrication. She realized she hadn't been the prize. She had been the distraction. She was the shiny object they polished to hide the rot underneath. She looked at our parents. Mom was trying to formulate a lie, her mouth opening and closing. Dad was looking at the floor. Madeline stepped back from them. She didn't run to me, but she stepped away from them. That was enough for now. I turned and walked out the front door. The night air was cool and smelled of the ocean. The valet line was chaotic, a traffic jam of luxury cars trying to escape the blast zone. As I walked toward my sedan, a figure stepped out from the shadows of the portico. It was Mrs. Gable, my high school English teacher. She was clutching her shawl tight around her shoulders. She looked at me, her eyes wet. "Elizabeth," she said softly. "Mrs. Gable." She hesitated, then shook her head. They told us you were unwell. They told us you were struggling with delusions. I believed them. I saw you in town a few years ago and I crossed the street because I didn't want to embarrass you. She reached out and touched my arm. I am so sorry I believed them. It's okay, I said, though it wasn't. They're very good at storytelling. You were always my brightest student, she whispered. I should have known. It became clear to me then that the abuse hadn't just been inside the house. My parents hadn't just mistreated me, they had trained the entire community to participate in my erasure. They had weaponized the town's politeness against me. But tonight, that weapon had backfired. I left Mrs. Gable and walked around the side of the building to the service entrance. There was one more thing I had to do. I wasn't going to leave a mess. That's what Carters do. I wasn't a Carter anymore. I was a CEO. Inside the kitchen, the staff was in a state of suspended animation. The chef was sitting on a crate looking defeated. The servers were whispering in huddles. When I walked in, silence fell. Sarah, the event planner, looked up from her phone. She looked terrified. Liz. Ms. Carter. I didn't know. I swear if I knew it was fraud. I know you didn't, Sarah, I said, my voice projecting authority. And I know none of your staff knew. I pulled a checkbook from my clutch. It was the business ledger for Summit Vendor Solutions. I am not going to let my parents' actions impact your livelihoods, I announced to the kitchen. I am covering all outstanding invoices for the catering, the staff wages, and the venue costs effective immediately. You will all be paid tonight. The relief in the room was palpable. It was physical. Shoulders dropped. Breath was released. I wrote the check, signed it with a flourish, and handed it to Sarah. Process this, then pack up, go home. Thank you, Sarah said, her voice trembling. Thank you, Liz. It's Elizabeth, I said. I walked back out to the parking lot. My attorney Marcus was leaning against his car, typing on his tablet. He looked up as I approached. The filings are done, he said, his voice crisp and professional. Fraud claims, identity theft, and a petition for an immediate freeze on any accounts linked to your SSN. I also drafted a restraining order, but we'll need a judge to sign off in the morning. Given the witnesses tonight, it won't be a problem. Good, I said. And the statement? Ready for release. Measured, factual. No ranting. Just a clarification of ownership regarding the vendors, and a note that you are cooperating with authorities regarding the unauthorized use of funds. Send it, I said. Elizabeth, Marcus said, pausing before he hit send. You know this burns the bridge, right? There's no coming back from this. The bridge was rotten, Marcus. I didn't burn it. I just stopped holding it up. I got into my car. As I started the engine, I saw one last scene play out in the rearview mirror. Ethan Hale was standing by his car. His parents were already inside the engine running, waiting for him. Madeline was standing a few feet away, still in her wedding dress, shivering in the cold. She reached out a hand toward him. Ethan looked at her. He didn't look angry. He looked exhausted. He looked like a man who had woken up in a stranger's house. He said something to her, short, final. He didn't yell. He simply shook his head, turned around, and got into the back seat of his parents' car. The car drove away, taillights fading into the dark. Madeline stood alone on the gravel. My parents were nowhere to be seen, likely hiding inside, avoiding the wreckage they had caused. Madeline was alone in the spotlight they had built for her, and for the first time, there was no one there to clap. I put my car in gear. I didn't honk. I didn't wave. I pulled out of the lot and turned onto the main road. I didn't look back. The rearview mirror was for checking traffic, not for dwelling on ghosts. The collapse of the Carter dynasty didn't happen with an explosion. It happened with a silence so profound it felt heavy. In Oak Haven, social death is a quiet affair. It starts with the invitations that stop arriving. Then the polite nods at the grocery store turn into averted gazes. Finally, the phone simply stops ringing. For my parents. Thomas and Margaret, the weeks following the engagement party, were a slow-motion suffocation. The story of what happened at Greystone Hall spread through the country club circuit faster than any virus. The specific details of the financial fraud, The forged signatures, the stolen identity, the desperate leveraging of their own daughter were too tawdry even for a town that thrived on gossip. People can forgive a lot of things in the upper crust: infidelity, addiction, even bankruptcy, if it's handled with dignity, but they cannot forgive the embarrassment of being duped. My parents had made the town's elite look foolish for believing their charade, and for that they were exiled. I didn't have to see it to know it was happening. I heard about it through the grapevine. I heard that the club revoked their membership due to unpaid dues and conduct violations. I heard that my father was asked to resign from the library board. I heard that the friends who had drunk their wine for decades were suddenly too busy to return calls. They tried to reach me, of course. Their tactics followed the textbook cycle of the narcissist losing control. First came the rage. I received voicemails from my father screaming about ungratefulness, about how I had assassinated the family name. Then came the guilt. My mother sent long, rambling emails about her failing health, claiming the stress I caused was giving her heart palpitations, implying that if she died, the blood would be on my hands. Then came the fake apologies. "We just wanted the best for Madeline, we got carried away," followed immediately by threats of countersuits that my lawyer Marcus laughed at as he filed them away in the evidence folder. Finally, they tried the family is everything angle, sending old photos of me as a toddler, trying to trigger a nostalgia for a happiness that had never actually existed. I didn't block them. I just didn't answer. I let the calls go to voicemail. I let the texts sit unread. I archived the emails. I treated their attempts at contact like spam, irrelevant noise that had no bearing on my operating system. I didn't need to fight them anymore. The restraining order was granted, the credit lines were locked, and the investigation was ongoing. They were no longer my parents. They were just defendants in a pending legal action. Instead of engaging in their chaos, I focused on reclaiming the one thing they had tried to strip from me: my name. For years, Elizabeth Carter was a name associated with disappointment. It was the name whispered with pity. I decided to change the definition. 2 months after the party, I sat for an interview with the state's largest business journal. I didn't do it for vanity. I did it for clarity. The headline read, "The Quiet Architect: How Elizabeth Carter Built a Logistics Empire from the Shadows." I told the story, not the personal drama, but the professional triumph. I talked about the supply chains, the vendor relationships, the late nights, building algorithms to predict shipping delays. I put my face on the cover, not as Liz, the mousy girl in the cardigan, but as Elizabeth, the CEO. I used that momentum to launch the Carter Brooks Initiative, a grant program named after my grandmother's maiden name, the only person in the family who had ever been kind to me. The program was simple. It provided capital and logistics support to small businesses in the area that were struggling to scale. I wanted to invest in the kind of people my parents mocked: the mechanics, the florists, the bakery owners. I wanted to prove that power wasn't about hoarding leverage. It was about building a foundation that could hold others up. The response was overwhelming. When I walked down Main Street now, people didn't look through me. They stopped to shake my hand. They pitched me ideas. They treated me with a respect that had nothing to do with my parents' social standing, and everything to do with the value I was actually creating. And then there was Madeline. We met on a rainy Tuesday in a coffee shop 3 towns over. It was neutral ground. She walked in wearing jeans and a raincoat, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She looked tired. She looked older. But for the first time in her life, she looked real. Ethan hadn't married her. The engagement had dissolved in the parking lot that night. His family, terrified of the scandal and the financial liability, had severed ties immediately. Madeline had been left with a dress she couldn't return and a future that had evaporated. She sat down across from me and didn't order anything. She just looked at her hands. "I got a job," she said quietly. "Oh?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. "Receptionist at a dental office. It's hard. People are rude." She looked up at me, a wry, sad smile touching her lips. I guess that's how I used to sound to service workers. Probably, I said honestly. She flinched, but she didn't look away. I moved out. I'm renting a studio. Mom and Dad, they wanted me to stay. They wanted me to help them fix things. They wanted me to call Ethan to beg him. She shook her head. I couldn't do it, Liz. I couldn't be the prop anymore. I'm proud of you, I said. Her eyes filled with tears. I don't know who I am, she confessed. For 26 years, I was just the pretty one. I was the heir. Now I'm just a receptionist with a broken engagement and a family everyone hates. You're not just that, I said, reaching across the table to put my hand over hers. You're free. It's terrifying, I know, but it's real. You get to decide who Madeline is now, not Mom, not Dad, you. She squeezed my hand back. It was a weak squeeze, tentative and unsure, but it was there. We didn't fix everything that afternoon. You don't undo decades of conditioning in an hour over coffee. But we started. She asked me how I learned to budget. I asked her about the books she liked to read, things she had never talked about because our parents didn't consider reading a socially advantageous hobby. It was a slow, painful process of getting to know a stranger who happened to have my DNA. But it was honest work. The final change wasn't out in the world, though. It was inside my own apartment. 6 months later, I woke up on a Sunday morning. The sun was streaming through the window, hitting the hardwood floor. My phone was on the nightstand, silent. My email inbox was full of contracts, not crises. I lay there for a moment, waiting for the familiar tightening in my chest, the dread that had woken me up every day since I was a child. The feeling that I was in trouble. The feeling that I had forgotten to do something or be someone that my mother required. The feeling that a slap was coming, metaphorical or literal. I waited, and I felt nothing. There was only the hum of the refrigerator and the sound of a bird chirping outside. The dread was gone. The cage door was open, and the predator that had paced outside it was declawed and toothless, shouting into a void I no longer inhabited. I got up and walked to the kitchen. I made coffee, the expensive beans I used to hide in the back of the cupboard. I poured a cup and stood by the window looking out at the skyline. I saw the city where my trucks were moving goods, where my grants were helping a young woman open her first bakery, where my name was printed on letterhead that meant something. I caught my reflection in the glass. I didn't see the ghost anymore. I didn't see the practice child. I saw a woman who had walked through the fire and came out carrying the torch. I took a sip of coffee and smiled. It's a funny thing about ghosts. Once you stop haunting yourself, everyone else starts seeing you clearly. Elizabeth finally found the peace she deserved, stepping out of the shadows and into her own light. It is a powerful reminder that sometimes the best revenge is simply succeeding on your own terms. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that subscribe button and let us know what you think below. We read every single comment of your thoughts. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Revenge Hour. We'll see you next time.